He laughed as he slapped the cuffs on her wrists, mocking her like she was nothing. But months later, when she walked into the courtroom in a judge's robe, his smirk vanished. Justice had come full circle. The mid-morning sun cast long, golden streaks through the towering skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. A humid haze clung to the streets, the scent of freshly brewed coffee from bustling cafes mixing with the faint tang of exhaust fumes. The city pulsed with energy. Businessmen hurried across intersections, street vendors called out their daily specials, and the occasional blare of a car horn punctuated the steady rhythm of the urban jungle. Amid this daily hustle, Rachel Lawson, a poised and brilliant defense attorney, navigated the crowded sidewalk with practiced ease. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, each step exuding confidence. At 36, Rachel had already made a name for herself in the legal world. A fierce advocate for justice, particularly in cases where the system was rigged against the marginalized. But beneath her sharp suits and commanding presence was a woman who had fought tooth and nail to stand where she did today. As she reached the courthouse steps, she adjusted the leather strap of her briefcase over her shoulder, taking in a deep breath. This place, this temple of justice, was where she had spent the better part of her career, arguing, persuading, and proving that the color of one's skin should never determine the weight of the law. Not far from where she stood, a police cruiser idled at the curb. Inside sat Officer Chad Whitaker, a veteran cop with over a decade on the force. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with the air of someone who never had to question his authority, Chad had learned long ago how the system worked, and he had no qualms about bending the rules when it suited him. He had seen too many activist lawyers like Rachel, always eager to turn every routine case into some grand crusade for justice. In his eyes, people like her were all the same, too idealistic, too eager to challenge authority, and far too confident for their own good. As Rachel strode past his cruiser, Chad leaned out of the window, his voice dripping with mockery. Well, look at that. Another loudmouth lawyer thinking she's gonna change the world. Rachel slowed, her sharp brown eyes locking onto his with an unwavering stare. A quiet smirk played at the corner of her lips, calm, collected, unshaken. "You'll learn soon enough, officer," she said coolly. Chad laughed, shaking his head as she walked away. He had no idea that the woman he had just dismissed would soon have the final say, where it mattered most. The courthouse hallways buzzed with their usual symphony of murmured conversations, the occasional clatter of heels against polished floors, and the distant echo of a gavel striking wood. Rachel Lawson moved through it all with quiet authority, her presence commanding but never boastful. Today was just another day, another case, another battle for justice. But what she didn't know, what no one in that courthouse knew yet, was that fate had already set the stage for an encounter that would shift the balance of power in ways neither she nor Officer Chad Whitaker could have predicted. Across town, Officer Chad Whitaker adjusted his sunglasses as he leaned back against his cruiser, the warm Georgia sun glinting off his badge. He wasn't in the mood for nonsense today. It had been a long week, and his patience was running thin. That was when he saw her, a young black woman in a sleek blue sedan, rolling to a stop at a red light. Chad didn't know her name, and in his mind, it didn't matter. What mattered was the instinct that kicked in, the one he'd never admit out loud, the one that whispered this one's worth checking out. Flipping on his lights, he pulled out behind her, watching as she signaled and pulled over to the curb. As he approached, his hand rested lightly on his holstered weapon. The driver's window rolled down, and Rachel Lawson's sharp, composed gaze met his. "License and registration," Chad said, his voice firm. Rachel didn't flinch. She had been here before, not as a suspect, but as a black woman who knew exactly how these interactions often played out. Without a word, she retrieved her wallet and car documents, handing them over with deliberate, steady movements. Chad glanced over them before looking back at her. His eyes narrowed. "You in a hurry, ma'am? Seemed like you rolled through that last stop sign back there." Rachel arched a brow. "I didn't. And if you check your dashcam, you'll see that's the truth." Chad let out a dry chuckle, tapping the top of her car with his fingers. "You lawyers always got something to say, don't you?" Rachel stayed quiet, her face unreadable. Chad, irritated by her composure, shook his head. Step out of the vehicle. Rachel's jaw tightened. Am I being detained? Step of the vehicle. Rachel knew the drill. Her hands remained visible as she opened the door and stepped onto the pavement. Turn around, Chad ordered. Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice even. On what grounds? Chad didn't answer. Instead, he reached for her arm, gripping it firmly. It wasn't necessary, she wasn't resisting, but that wasn't the point. The point was to establish dominance, to make it clear who held the power here. Rachel clenched her teeth as cold metal closed around her wrists. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, Chad announced, a smug smirk tugging at his lips. A small crowd had begun to gather, murmuring among themselves. A passerby pulled out their phone, recording. Rachel inhaled deeply, calming the storm rising in her chest. This wasn't just about her. It was about the system, about the unspoken rules that let men like Chad play judge and jury on the streets. As he pushed her toward the squad car, Rachel met his gaze over her shoulder. You have no idea what you've just done, she said, her voice steady. Chad only laughed. Yeah? And what exactly are you going to do about it? She didn't answer, but he would find out soon enough. The tight grip of cold metal handcuffs around Rachel Lawson's wrists wasn't unfamiliar. She had represented countless clients who had been subjected to the same indignity. Some of them guilty, many of them innocent, all of them deserving of due process. But this time was different. This time, she was the one being led toward the back seat of a police cruiser, her rights trampled by the very system she had sworn to fight against. Officer Chad Whitaker, his chest puffed with arrogance, tightened his grip on her arm as he guided her toward his vehicle. Rachel remained composed, her spine rigid with defiance. You should really think about what you're doing, officer, she said coolly. Chad chuckled under his breath. What I'm doing is enforcing the law. Maybe next time, you'll keep that big lawyer mouth of yours shut. Rachel's fingers curled into a fist behind her back. The weight of injustice pressed heavy on her chest, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of breaking her composure. Not now. Not ever. The small crowd that had gathered murmured among themselves, their eyes darting between the officer and the woman they recognized as one of the city's most respected defense attorneys. One voice finally rang out. An older black woman with graying curls, shaking her head in disappointment. That's Rachel Lawson. You don't know who you're messing with, officer. Chad barely spared her a glance. He shoved Rachel into the back seat, slamming the door shut behind her. Rachel exhaled slowly, steadying herself as the cruiser pulled away from the curb. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was a test of everything she stood for, and Chad Whitaker had just failed. It wasn't long before Rachel found herself sitting in a dimly lit holding cell, her sharp suit wrinkled but her resolve unshaken. She had made her one phone call, to her closest friend and fellow attorney, Michael Carter, a powerhouse litigator known for dismantling corrupt officers in court. Less than an hour later, the precinct's front doors burst open, and Michael stormed in, his presence commanding immediate attention. I want Rachel Lawson released. Now. His voice was firm, controlled, but his dark eyes blazed with fury. The desk sergeant, a weary-looking officer who had clearly seen enough lawyers for one day, sighed heavily. She was arrested for obstruction. Michael scoffed. Obstruction of what? The officer's ego. He slid a legal document onto the counter. That's a formal complaint, and here's a court order demanding her immediate release. Unless you want your entire department to be slapped with a civil rights lawsuit, I suggest you follow protocol. The sergeant exchanged a glance with the arresting officer, Chad Whitaker himself, who stood in the corner with his arms crossed. You serious? Chad sneered. She was being uncooperative. Michael turned his fiery gaze toward Chad, stepping closer. She was being a black woman who knew her rights. And you? You were being a coward hiding behind a badge. The room fell silent. Moments later, Rachel was released. As she walked past Chad, she paused just long enough to lock eyes with him. I told you, she said, her voice measured but firm. You have no idea what you've just done. Chad smirked. We'll see about that, counselor. Rachel didn't look back. She had bigger things to handle. A week later, Rachel sat in her office, her fingers drumming against the polished wooden desk. She had spent the past few days gathering every piece of evidence she could against Chad Whitaker. His history of excessive force complaints, his troubling arrest patterns, his disciplinary record, which had been conveniently swept under the rug more than once. But the real blow had come when she discovered that this wasn't just about her. Chad had a pattern. Over the last 5 years, more than a dozen black men and women had been wrongfully arrested under vague charges when stopped by Chad Whitaker. Many of them had lost jobs, missed important opportunities, and had their lives thrown into disarray. And Rachel had the receipts to prove it. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard before she hit send. The official complaint was filed. The case against Chad Whitaker was now in motion. Chad Whitaker never saw it coming. Days after Rachel filed her complaint, the precinct was flooded with reporters. Whispers turned into headlines, headlines turned into protests, and soon, the weight of his past actions came crashing down on him. Internal Affairs launched an investigation. The mayor's office issued a statement. And suddenly, Chad found himself placed on administrative leave, the first step toward what everyone knew was inevitable. But the real reckoning came in the form of a letter Chad received 1 week later. He had been summoned to court. And when he stepped into that courtroom, dressed in his police uniform but stripped of his usual arrogance, his stomach twisted into knots. Because seated at the judge's bench, wearing her black robes with quiet authority, was Judge Rachel Lawson. His mouth went dry. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. But Chad knew he knew that the woman he had mocked, humiliated, and wrongfully arrested now had the power to determine his fate. And for the first time in his career, Officer Chad Whitaker understood what it felt like to be truly powerless. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, community leaders, and everyday citizens filled the seats, all waiting to witness the moment that had been building since Rachel Lawson's wrongful arrest. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that turned every breath into something heavy and unspoken. At the defendant's table sat Officer Chad Whitaker, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His once confident demeanor had eroded, replaced with a nervous energy he couldn't quite suppress. His attorney, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a weary expression, whispered something to him, but Chad barely heard it. His gaze was locked on the judge's bench on her. She was composed, her black judicial robes making her look even more imposing than she had in her sharp attorney suits. But it wasn't just her attire. It was her presence. The way she carried herself. The way she looked directly at Chad with the quiet authority of a woman who had fought her way up from the bottom and now sat at the highest seat in the room. For the first time in his life, Chad understood what it felt like to be judged. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Rachel Lawson presiding. Rachel picked up her gavel, tapping it once against the bench. We are here today for the case of Officer Chad Whitaker, accused of misconduct, wrongful arrest, and abuse of power, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. Officer Whitaker, how do you plead? Chad hesitated, his mouth dry. Not guilty, Your Honor. Rachel's lips pressed together, but she nodded. Very well. Let's proceed. The prosecution wasted no time. They presented video evidence of Chad's pattern of stops, detailed reports of his history of excessive force, and even testimonies from victims, people whose lives had been upended by his unchecked power. With every new piece of evidence, Chad's shoulders sagged further. He knew he had been reckless, but he never thought it would come to this. He had always believed the system would protect him, that his badge made him untouchable. But today the system wasn't his shield. It was his reckoning. Hours passed as testimonies were heard. By the time closing arguments began, the weight of the case was crushing down on everyone in the room. Chad's defense attorney took one final shot, leaning into the argument that had protected officers like Chad for years. Your Honor, my client was simply doing his job. Was he aggressive? Perhaps. But the streets are dangerous, and officers must make quick decisions under pressure. He made an arrest based on reasonable suspicion. This is not misconduct. It's the reality of law enforcement. Rachel studied Chad, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to the prosecution. Final remarks? Michael Carter, Rachel's longtime friend and now lead prosecutor, stood. His voice was calm but laced with conviction. Your Honor, this case is not about one bad arrest. It's about a pattern of discrimination, abuse, and a blatant disregard for the law that Officer Whitaker swore to uphold. How many innocent people must be humiliated, detained, and stripped of their dignity before we say enough? The law does not exist to protect only those who wear the badge. It exists to protect everyone. And today, justice demands accountability. Rachel let the words settle before shifting her gaze back to Chad. This court will take a brief recess before delivering the verdict, she announced, tapping the gavel once. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people stood to stretch or discuss the case in hushed tones. Rachel, however, remained seated. Her mind churned with thoughts. She had dreamed of this moment, of looking Chad Whitaker in the eye and showing him what real power looked like. Not the power to oppress, but the power to deliver justice. And yet, something inside her warred with the moment. This wasn't just about him. This was about all the men like him. The system that enabled them. The people who suffered because of it. Delivering a guilty verdict would be easy. It would be justified. But would it change anything? Would punishing one man truly dismantle the machine that had allowed him to thrive? Rachel closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. She had spent years fighting this system from the outside. Now, as a judge, she had the power to reform it from within. When she reopened her eyes, she knew what she had to do. The courtroom reconvened. The audience sat in silent anticipation, waiting for Rachel to speak. She lifted her gavel, but before striking it, she addressed the room. This case has weighed heavily on me, not just as a judge, but as someone who has seen firsthand the ways in which power can be abused, she began. Officer Whitaker's actions were not isolated incidents. They were part of a long-standing pattern that reflects a deeper issue within law enforcement and our justice system. Chad's fingers gripped the table. Rachel met his gaze. After reviewing all evidence and testimonies, this court finds Officer Chad Whitaker guilty of misconduct and wrongful arrest. The room erupted, some with cheers, others with gasps of relief. But Rachel wasn't finished. However, she continued, I believe accountability must go beyond punishment. Real change requires reform. The murmurs quieted. She turned to Chad directly. Officer Whitaker, you will face disciplinary action, including a formal demotion and mandatory retraining in de-escalation and anti-bias policing. Additionally, I am ordering an independent review of past cases where you made arrests under questionable circumstances. If further wrongdoing is found, additional charges may be filed. Chad's face paled. Rachel wasn't just sentencing him. She was stripping away the protection of the system that had shielded him for years. She looked out at the audience. But more than that, today marks the beginning of a greater initiative. Effective immediately, I will be working with the District Attorney's Office to implement stronger oversight on police misconduct cases. Officers will be held to the same standards of justice as the civilians they are sworn to protect. No more backroom deals. No more dismissed complaints. No more unchecked power. The courtroom erupted into applause. Chad slumped in his chair, realization dawning on him. This wasn't just about his punishment. Rachel had just ensured that officers like him would never be able to operate with impunity again. And as he was escorted from the courtroom, his arrogance shattered, he finally understood. Rachel Lawson hadn't just won a case. She had changed the game entirely. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Rachel Lawson remained seated behind the judge's bench, her fingers lightly grazing the wooden gavel. She had delivered justice, not just to Chad Whitaker but to a system that had long needed accountability. And yet, she knew this was only the beginning. She watched as people filed out, their conversations buzzing with newfound hope. The Black community members in attendance, many of whom had spent years fighting against unjust policing, left with their heads held a little higher. A few approached her, nodding their silent appreciation. Michael Carter was the last to leave. He paused near the bench, a proud smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You really did it, Rachel," he said, crossing his arms. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been on the wrong side of a badge like Whitaker's." Rachel exhaled, allowing herself a small smile. "One case won't fix everything, but it's a start." Michael nodded. "A damn good start." As he turned to leave, Rachel called out to him. "Mike!" He stopped. "We're not done," she said. "I meant what I said about police reform. I need your help to make it happen." Michael's smirk widened into a full grin. "You know, I'm always down to shake the system." Rachel nodded, a determined glint in her eyes. Change wasn't just coming. It had begun. Chad sat in the back seat of his lawyer's car, staring out the window as they drove away from the courthouse. The city felt different now. For the first time in his life, he was on the other side of justice. Demoted, his reputation in shambles, his past arrests under review. The career he had built on arrogance and unchecked authority was now crumbling. "This isn't over," his lawyer muttered beside him. "We'll appeal." Chad didn't respond. He barely heard the words. Deep down, he knew there was no appeal that could undo what had happened today. He had mocked Rachel Lawson, humiliated her, arrested her for no reason but his own prejudice. And now she had determined his fate. For the first time in years, Chad felt something foreign creep into his chest. Regret. Real, undeniable regret. Rachel didn't stop after Chad's trial. She spent the following weeks meeting with city officials, legal experts, and activists to begin implementing the police oversight initiative she had promised. New policies were drafted. Transparency measures were put in place. And most importantly, a review board independent of the police department was established to investigate complaints of misconduct. The resistance was fierce. Certain officers pushed back. Union leaders tried to discredit her. But Rachel stood firm. The people were with her. And when the first corrupt officer was officially removed due to the new review process, one with an even worse record than Chad Whitaker, she knew they had won a battle much larger than any single case. It wasn't just about Chad. It was about dismantling a system that had protected men like him for far too long. And it was working. One evening, Rachel found herself walking through the same neighborhood where she had been arrested months before. The air was crisp, the streetlights casting golden glows on the pavement. She stopped in front of the small cafe where it had all begun, the place where Chad had mocked her, doubted her, reduced her to nothing more than a black woman he thought he could intimidate. But he had been wrong. She wasn't just a black woman. She was a lawyer, a judge, a fighter, a force of justice that no badge could silence. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. Judge Lawson. She turned to see the same older black woman who had called out during her arrest. The woman smiled, eyes filled with something Rachel recognized. Pride. "You did good, baby," she said warmly. "You made them see us." Rachel felt her throat tighten, but she smiled. "We're just getting started," she replied. The woman chuckled. "That's what I like to hear." Rachel gave one last glance at the cafe before turning away, walking into the night with purpose. She had fought for justice, and she wasn't done yet. Months passed, and the city had begun to feel different. It wasn't perfect, true change never happened overnight, but there was a shift, a tangible sense of accountability in the air. Officers who had once acted with impunity now thought twice before abusing their power. Community leaders had a seat at the table in discussions about police reform. And most importantly, victims of misconduct finally had a voice. Rachel Lawson had made sure of that. One morning, as she sat in her chambers, reviewing case files, a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Michael Carter stepped inside, holding a newspaper. He tossed it onto her desk, a smirk playing on his lips. "Thought you might like to see this," he said. Rachel glanced at the front page. Judge Rachel Lawson's reforms bring accountability to city's police force. She scanned the article which detailed the success of the new oversight board, the internal restructuring of law enforcement, and the impact it was already having on the community. Rachel set the paper down, exhaling slowly. Michael watched her. "You did it, Rachel." She shook her head. "We did it. And we're still doing it." Michael chuckled. "You never stop, do you?" She met his gaze, determination etched in her features. "We can't afford to." Michael nodded. He knew she was right. The work wasn't over. But they had started something unstoppable. That evening, Rachel sat on the rooftop of her apartment, overlooking the city. The skyline stretched before her, lights flickering against the night like scattered stars. She thought about her journey, how, just months ago, she had been humiliated, handcuffed, and thrown into the back of a squad car. How Chad Whitaker had laughed at her, belittled her, dismissed her. How he had assumed she was powerless. But she hadn't been. She had turned that moment of injustice into a revolution. Her entire life she had fought to prove herself. Not just as a lawyer, not just as a judge, but as a black woman in a system that had never been built to protect people like her. And now she was helping rebuild that system into something better. Something just. A gust of wind blew through the rooftop, rustling her hair. She closed her eyes, breathing it in. This fight was bigger than her. Bigger than Chad Whitaker. Bigger than any single case. It was about creating a world where no one had to endure what she had. Where justice was truly blind. Where the law protected everyone, not just those in power. And as long as she had a voice, she would use it. The next day, Rachel stepped into the courthouse, the halls bustling with people seeking justice. Some for the first time, others for the 100th. She paused, watching them. Some looked nervous. Some looked hopeful. Some looked like they had been fighting their entire lives. She knew their stories, because she had lived with them. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her posture and walked forward. Justice wasn't just a ruling. It wasn't just a verdict. It was a fight, commitment, a movement, and she was ready for whatever came next. Because the fight for justice never ended. It only began. Justice is not given, it is fought for. And real change happens when those who have been silenced refuse to stay quiet.